Advent is often described as a season of waiting, but it is more than that. It has a particular atmosphere, almost a sound of its own. Not a loud sound, not something that breaks into daily life with urgency or spectacle, but a quiet expectancy. In the Catholic imagination, Advent is when time seems to slow down, when the Church pauses after a long year and listens again for something ancient and familiar approaching softly. It is a season of lamps kept burning, of hearts learning to recognize a voice that does not shout. On the evening of December 20, 2025, that quiet expectancy was very real in southern Italy. In the town of Conversano, far from the constant attention given to places like Rome or Milan, the cathedral stood as it always had, surrounded by stone streets that remembered old processions and centuries of prayer. Its walls had absorbed generations of whispered confessions, sung hymns, and homilies that were spoken for those present and then released into silence. Nothing about that night suggested it would be different from countless other Advent evenings before it. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. The faithful had gathered for the Christmas novena. Candles flickered gently. The gospel was proclaimed. There was a sense of reverence and inward focus, a fragile calm that felt appropriate for the season. No one expected that what would be spoken from the pulpit would travel far beyond the cathedral doors, let alone become a subject of national debate. And yet, that is exactly what happened. The celebrant was Archbishop Giuseppe Laterza, who also served as Apostolic Nuncio to Central Africa. He was not only a theologian but a man shaped by years of pastoral work and diplomacy, particularly in regions where faith is lived under pressure and often at personal cost. His homily focused on one of the most sacred moments in Christian memory, the Annunciation. The moment when heaven touches earth, when an angel speaks, and a young woman listens. Mary was at the center of his reflection. Not as a distant symbol or a polished icon, but as a real human being faced with an overwhelming and impossible question. The Archbishop spoke about freedom, but not as it is commonly understood in modern discourse. He spoke of freedom as the Church has long understood it, not as the absence of limits or obligations, but as the ability to give oneself fully to truth and love. Then came the sentence that would change everything. He said that Mary is truly free because she knows how to obey, and that she is the freest woman in the world. Inside the cathedral, the words fell gently. They sounded like a familiar theological idea, one echoed through centuries of Christian thought. Great theologians had spoken of obedience not as submission to domination, but as a free and loving consent to God's will. Almost casually, the Archbishop added a short remark, delivered without emphasis or apparent intention to provoke, "Tell that to the feminists." It was a brief sentence, not framed as an argument, not expanded upon, simply spoken and left behind as the homily moved on. In the cathedral, it caused no visible stir. But the homily was being broadcast live on the cathedral's official channels, as many churches do today. Within hours, fragments of the sermon began circulating online. Not the full homily. Not the scriptural context or the careful theological reasoning. Just the sentence, clipped and isolated. In the world of social media, context is often lost, nuance becomes a disadvantage, and what spreads is what can be reacted to immediately. Reaction came quickly. What had been intended as a reflection on Marian freedom was recast as a cultural provocation. The word obedience, filtered through modern political and ideological language, was no longer heard as a spiritual concept but as a judgment. Mary, one of the most beloved figures in Catholic devotion, was suddenly positioned in opposition to contemporary feminism, not through a careful comparison but through repetition and framing. The debate did not unfold in theological circles or academic discussions. It unfolded where debates now tend to happen, on social media platforms, television panels, and comment sections. Criticism followed a predictable pattern. Instead of engaging with doctrine or exploring what the Church actually means by freedom and obedience, attention focused on language, tone, and symbolism. Was it appropriate, critics asked, to place the Virgin Mary alongside a broad and diverse cultural movement under the label feminists? Was the remark dismissive or insulting? Did it symbolically devalue women who understand freedom differently? The irony was that no individual or legally defined group had been attacked. No policy was proposed. Yet in the climate of modern outrage, implication carried more weight than intention. The homily ceased to be a homily. It became a case, a symbol, a battlefield for deeper cultural anxieties. For some, it demonstrated that the Church had not learned to speak carefully enough in a sensitive social environment. For others, it showed that even restrained theological language could be turned against itself. What was lost almost immediately was the heart of the message. Mary was not being presented as passive or erased. She was being honored as a woman whose freedom was so complete that she could say yes without coercion. But that is not how the story traveled. Headlines hardened, interpretation solidified, and theological language was translated into political accusation. Whether he intended it or not, Archbishop Laterza found himself under fire. The controversy was not only about feminism. It touched deeper questions of authority, of who defines freedom, and of whether religious speech still has room to exist in a culture that hears everything through ideological filters. As the reaction grew, something deeper became visible. There was a tension between two worlds that no longer shared a common language. The Church speaks of obedience as freely chosen love. Modern discourse often hears obedience as a loss of autonomy. The Church venerates Mary as the highest expression of human dignity, while modern frameworks often define dignity solely as independence from any higher claim. When these languages collide, misunderstanding is almost inevitable. The speed and intensity of the reaction revealed a kind of readiness, a pre-existing suspicion toward religious speech, especially when it touches on gender, authority, or moral anthropology. The question shifted from, "What did he mean?" to, "How did this make people feel?" And once emotions are stirred, they rarely wait for explanation. 2 days later, Archbishop Laterza spoke publicly through an interview with La Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno. By then, the story had taken on a life of its own. In the digital age, controversy grows faster than clarification. What began as a homily had become a national conversation about sexism, power, and the Church's place in society. In the interview, the Archbishop was no longer asked to explain theology. He was asked to account for impact. Had he intended to offend? Did he understand the harm his words might have caused? Should the Church rethink its language? His responses were calm and firmly theological. He rejected accusations of sexism and explained that his words were rooted entirely in Christian anthropology. Freedom, he said, is not absolute autonomy or self-definition in isolation. True freedom exists within relationship, especially the relationship between the human person and God. He reminded readers that Mary's yes at the Annunciation was not forced. The angel announced and waited. Mary could have said no, and that possibility is precisely what makes her consent meaningful. Without freedom, consent is meaningless, and obedience becomes empty. In this light, Mary is not a symbol of passivity but of courage. She accepted a destiny that exposed her to misunderstanding and danger, not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to trust. Laterza also spoke from experience, recalling his years of pastoral work in Africa, where he actively supported female education and protected women in vulnerable situations. These were not abstract claims but concrete realities that contradicted the caricature of him as indifferent to women's dignity. Still, Caricatures are resilient, and facts rarely dissolve them completely. Toward the end of the interview, he added a sentence that would also be closely examined. If anyone felt offended, he said, he humbly apologized. He did not retract the theology or deny the substance of his homily, but he acknowledged the emotional impact of his words. To some, this was humility. To others, a concession. But it shifted the tone of the debate. The outrage softened and fragmented. Supporters argued that the controversy showed an inability to distinguish between theological and political language. Critics insisted that pastors must exercise greater caution in a fragmented social context. Both perspectives held some truth. Beneath the surface, however, the issue was larger than one sentence or one archbishop. It reflected a broader climate in which religious discourse faces increasing scrutiny, not through direct censorship but through social pressure, public shaming, and rapid amplification. Preaching is not forbidden, but it is problematized. A homily can be orthodox and pastoral yet still be judged unacceptable because of how it might be interpreted outside its intended context. This climate is not unique to Italy. International examples, such as debates in Canada over hate speech laws and religious expression, illustrate growing concern about blurred lines between protection and restriction. The Conversino homily showed how quickly a sermon rooted in centuries of theology can become a political object. A phrase spoken in passing becomes evidence. The pulpit becomes entangled with public relations. The church is not powerless, but it is navigating unfamiliar terrain. The question becomes not only whether something is true, but how it will be received and whether it is worth saying at all. As the controversy faded, it ended without formal consequences. No sanctions were imposed. But something had changed. Even without punishment, memory shapes behavior. Priests hesitate a little longer. Bishops soften language. Self-censorship grows quietly. The deeper issue remains, whether there is still room in public space for religious language that speaks in its own voice without violating dignity or law. The Church continues to walk a narrow path between proclamation and prudence. The tension is not new, but the speed and intensity of modern reactions are. As Advent turns to Christmas, the Church returns to the same scene it always does: a woman, an angel, a question, a choice. Mary does not ask how her yes will be interpreted. She asks only whether it is true. In a world that measures words by reaction, the gospel still measures them by faithfulness. And that may be the lasting question left by the story of Conversino: how we listen, and whether we still allow ancient words to speak beyond modern categories. If this message touched your heart, like this video and share your thoughts in the comment or comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.